All right, next episode of The Experiment, unscripted with Tommi Forsström, and I'm Giff Constable. This week Tommi on LinkedIn had a little mic drop moment where he was talking about the negatives around healthy tension, I think it was. So let me kick it over to you and let's see if there's any there. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me paint the picture. It was late at night. A frustrated 45-year-old man was sitting at his computer, having seen the 20th millionth scenario where a company with clearly antagonistic cross-departmental relationships, alluding to it as like the product leader's job being to manage the healthy tension between product and engineering. And like that's all I was really calling bullshit on is there's a whole bunch of reply guys hopped on a thread and were like, but actually, like tension between the crafts creates great products. Yeah, of course it does. Like that's the whole point that we bring cross-functional people in to have a different perspective on the problem and the solution. But what I don't love is this like whitewashing of antagonism as specifically the words healthy tension. And that was like what I was just in my 10:30 p.m., I'm not going to write anything more uh mode. That's all I was commenting on is I'm just so tired of this, like taking it for granted that there's this like deep antagonism between these functions, and it's okay if you just call it healthy tension. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does. I find it fascinating that anyone would call that healthy tension. That sounds like unhealthy tension to me. Um, but but yeah, no, okay, I'm in agreement with you. And this actually brings us back to what we have been talking about a bit and what you've been writing about in your newsletter, which is the breakdowns between functions, which you can't gloss over. You can't whitewash. You can't pretend that that's healthy tension if it's really broken down. Because, and especially at the executive level, um, when I have had a breakdown, and it's happened for me, I'll just be honest with you, a few times, um, with another executive, that is so palpable to the entire organization and it ripples all the way down through the organization and it's really bad for everyone and sometimes it's really hard to solve. You've been thinking about this a lot this week. So like go on a little bit more about unhealthy tension, either between the functions or really at the top.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this from a number of angles, whether it's from the thing that I was reacting to the other night of just like stop calling antagonism and unconstructive friction as healthy tension, but also through the lens of like, uh, really spending time on the whole founder mode, manager mode dichotomy
Okay.
and trying to parse like what makes companies slip into manager mode. Because, like I asserted in my newsletter, I've yet to meet a leader who's like, I'm here to create inertia, process, risk aversion. Like hell, let's go. Let's
Right.
be mediocre and bland. Nobody does that. Nobody tries to do that.
Mhm.
But companies slip into manager mode usually because they end up spending more time trying to like manage that healthy tension between different departments. I mean, engineering and product and sales, whatever, sales and marketing. Like, why aren't you accepting our leads? Like, all of these departments have this like left unmanaged, there's conflicting incentives, which just ends up in a lot of boilerplate process and events and meetings after meetings after meetings and write-ups and agreement and buy-in, when the real problem is just that the leaders at the top just don't spend time understanding each other's worlds and fully converging on a shared vision. It's not going to make all of those problems go away, but it'll meaningfully make it easier to then kind of manage the functional incentives, if you will, for easier collaboration and less unnecessary boilerplate alignment nonsense.
I mean, it's not entirely leadership conflict as we talked about last week. Some of it's sort of the effect of scale, trying to scale, how that requires dividing and conquering a little bit, how it requires this incredible combination of accountability and coaching to ripple all the way down from manager to manager to manager to manager, so that you know, the dynamics that you can have at a smaller organization can scale at a larger one because everything is done in small degrees as opposed to really large degrees. But what happens is, you know, as we know, rules get put in place to overcome the gaps that emerge there and all the inconsistencies in terms of management talent and level and stuff. But but I do agree with you that the worst is when the functions aren't getting along. They aren't trying to be empathetic or understanding or valuing or appreciating the other side. They're jumping to conclusions, or they're holding their nose, or they're making assumptions, dehumanizing, even the other humans in the organization, and that can happen at a functional level, and it can certainly happen at a leadership level.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm probably being overly harsh at leaders, but hey, they get paid the somewhat higher dollars because they're responsible for everything, whether it's leadership conflict or just like leadership juniority to not understand the minor incompatibilities of different departments. Like you run sales very differently than you run product, then you run product
Yep.
very different than you run engineering. And if you're going to just run the department in isolation by kind of the generic norms of that function, you're going to run into real conflicts between the departments as they kind of run on a different cadence, different type of incentivization, and ultimately different functional norms. Unless the leader understands, at least to some degree, all the other departments and understands like the incompatibilities and the opportunities to plug those in together, even at the to the detriment of their own department. You know what I mean? Like I gave the example in my newsletter where in order for to maximize like global, like collective company wide output and efficiency, I had to make choices that were against my better judgment in the isolation of product,
Right.
like trimming down on agility because I knew that the end to end of building for the market and conquering the customer type required us to take a little bit of a different tact
Yep.
to empower sales. You know what I mean?
Yep.
If I were just pig-headedly being like, this is how you do great product, like, period, exclamation point, it would have been a disaster.
Right.
And the same thing, like the sales leader took time to understand why product is so different. And it's those conversations that ultimately end up with really great organizations instead of the United Nations of like well-running functions that don't come together.
I mean, it's absolutely, staying with product leaders for a second, it's absolutely worth taking the extra mental time to think through the incentive systems and the value systems of other functions. But even then, it could still break down. I like, my weird career. I've been thrown in enterprise sales seat. I've been a marketer. I've had to do a lot of finance. I have a lot of empathy, and I really appreciate a lot of these roles. Not simply because I've had to do them, but that's allowed me to feel closer to them all. But even with that, sometimes things break down. I care so much about the craft of design and engineering, and yet, I've had a CTO. I've had CTOs where we're like, uh, peas in a pod. I've had CTOs where we are not, where we do not see eye to eye. I've had heads of marketing where it's the same, where we can really get along on a personal level, and we've put a lot of effort into trying to work the personal connection and have coffees and like, and yet somehow when it came down to like, what do we think is important? What are we trying to get done? It, I found myself in situations of such misalignment that that it's end up kind of overcoming the efforts to have a great personal relationship. To the point that I'm like, yeah, I'd be happy to have a coffee with these people again. I respect them, but we were not working well together. What do you like? To me, those have been the really hard situations. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of what you do about those.
I wish I knew. Let's say if I knew the exact answer, I would probably be the CEO of Apple, Google, and Facebook put together. Um, because end of day, like as much as we love to like make frameworks and like proceduralize our work, especially on leadership level, it's a freaking human game.
Yeah.
Like, and humans are these like cognitively limited emotional meat bags that are soon going
That's
to be
so
replaced.
romantic of you, Tommy.
Sorry, I've been using that description to describe human drivers and why autonomous vehicles can't come fast enough because, you know, unless they start emulating road rage in AI. But yeah, end of day, like so much of a company's performance, and you especially as an engineer, when I came to leadership teams and I started running into like executive coaches and these like transformation consultants, and I was like, what a cargo cult cottage industry of scamming this is. But it didn't take me long to realize, like, no, that's the real multiplier is helping these, it takes a certain personality to be an executive, and you're usually not like the most easygoing, whatever, let's just chill type of person when you're in those rooms. It really takes somebody with skills to build human relationships, to bust through some of that, and to even go further than just the, hey, we're having coffee and talking about the game or whatever, like learning to work despite your differences. I don't know if I'm a glutton for music documentaries, and uh, 20 years ago, Metallica came out with the Some Kind of Monster documentary on them making a record, and they were laughed at so much for bringing in like a basically a teamwork coach to the studio, and they were like, "What the hell? You're a metal band with a coach," and I was like, snotty 20-year-old, 20-something-year-old, and I was like, "Ha ha ha! Look at those losers with their coach." I look at that documentary now, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this person saved this basically this like business unit of Metallica
Yep.
because similar thing. They just couldn't work as human beings together on something creative because of their differences." So anyway, that's my long defense of
I
working
think
on the
there's an
human aspect.
interesting thing that you just actually hit upon. Companies don't do this, what you just said. I mean, I have had you know, Peter Lehrman over at Axial, where I ran product and engineering for a little bit. Peter's a lovely, lovely guy. And he had an executive coach that he worked with as a CEO, as a founder CEO. And he would bring that coach into our executive meetings to observe and things like that. And that was, and the comments that the coach made, was a very smart, perceptive guy, were very interesting to us all. That's not quite the same thing as actually bringing someone in who can coach the entire executive team and really manage confidentiality, and what you leak and what you don't. Um, but to be able to, if I had had a really great coach, and say the CMO had a really great coach, and to vent about each other to this person who could sort of like see the big picture, could get out of the emotion and kind of sort of say, okay, like, Giff, you need to, you know, I think you need to ask some questions, ask these questions, and the same thing to the CMO. That might have helped us navigate some of what started to feel increasingly intractable, even though both of us were working so hard to work through it. It just kept on breaking down, breaking down, breaking down. I don't know, the notion of having a C-suite coach that isn't there to rat on the team to the CEO, but is just there to help this group get along, never occurred to me really, even though I'd seen like small versions of that in action. That's a neat idea.
I've had a couple of good experiences of that. I mean, both the person-to-person coaching, but also the somebody coming in and even like sitting in on leadership team offsites and offering feedback on how we work together, how we problem solve, how we do divergent thinking to convergent thinking, and all that stuff. Which like it sometimes just simply that outsider's view, like somebody who is a perceptive individual, like yeah, it helps a lot. Um, and to kind of your point, sometimes it just might, whether it's with one person or whatever, it might be fairly intractable. And I've come to realize that all the stuff that I talk about, like how to drive incentives for your team, like the leadership team isn't immune to that. Like every leader has one-on-ones with the CEO, and the CEO is probably driving those leaders pretty hard, you know, yelling to the engineering leader, like, why is our site down like 37 seconds last week? And the marketing, they're like, why isn't the pipeline stuffed with leads? And so everybody has, and every leader is like stressed out as hell. So
Yep.
there might not be explicit incentives, but they're very deep, implicit, like what will make me feel that I'm doing a good job in my position. And
Yep.
some of those like human to human connections might still just be acting out like intrinsic motivators, like how do I how do I survive in this position? Because like let's face it, startup C levels are like, you're happy to keep one of those jobs for a couple of quarters running. So that can drive a lot of that. Like no matter how well you get along with somebody and how aligned you are, if your incentives are pulling you apart, there's just no way around it.
Yeah. And you can't really bring this to the CEO. The CEO doesn't want to hear this. They're like, they just want their C-suite to get along, solve it, and like don't make the personalities their problem. So it's
Yep.
very frustrating for a CEO. So, having, I don't know, the idea of having someone who can not just on a one-off basis, an offsite here or there, but actually work with folks, and work with multiple people rather than just like everyone having their own coach is kind of intriguing. Um, it's because this is damn hard to solve,
Yeah.
even with best intentions.
I've also like, even though the engineer like realist in me is always like all these like Myers-Briggs and whatever other I can't remember what all these like personality tests
Mhm.
are, even though they're like basically as good as horoscopes.
Enneagram, yep.
And yeah, they're basically like horoscopes and tarot cards, but it's basically any mechanism that gets you as a group to articulate who you are as a person, even if it's through like, heck, you can go on like BuzzFeed and do like, which Disney princess are you? Like something that gets you to articulate who you are as a person and then meet another person through the lens of like, what are our differences in like how we view the world, what motivates us, what stresses us, can unlock some really deep, complex interaction patterns. And that's usually what I've seen coaches do really well is like, they're just a catalyst. They don't really do anything. They just
Right.
get the people to meet on a more fundamental level than like, can we have a fun little chat and can we align on a strategy?
Well, and a lot of executive teams don't lean into working on this on a continual basis. You know, you might, you know, yeah, like, I've often had leadership offsites where you do one of these personality things, or it's everyone read the manual to me for each other and try to build empathy and understanding of how does this person like to be communicated with? Like what stresses them out? How are they misunderstood? These are all interesting questions.
Yep.
But it often doesn't happen on a recurring basis because we get caught up in the recurring and stressful work of trying to make businesses great. But it's an ongoing thing.
100%. And
And I think everyone can detect where things are starting to break down. Sometimes it's hard for the CEO to detect. The aperture of information tightens so much to the CEO, and it's so hard to understand what's happening on the ground, whereas every employee is like, oh yeah, those two executives are not getting along. They smile in the hallway, but woo, it's chilly. And like, yeah, so as a CEO, he's like, how do you detect that? Because everyone's going to be on their best behavior in the meetings that you're in.
yeah, I mean, even that's like a good heuristic for maturity. Like one of the things that I've like caught myself doing early on, and I've like given my own personal blood oath that I will never do, even if I hate the marketing leader, even if I hate the sales leader, my team will never know. You know what I mean? Like that stuff needs to be left in the leadership team meeting, because the worst thing you can do as a leader is to let that friction bleed over to your team. Because if your team starts being antagonistic to another team's
Yep.
leader or viewing them as not good because their leader is putting that into the drinking water, the game's already over. And that is something that I like. I think I do pretty well these days. Of course, I'm human and maybe sometimes make that mistake, but like I don't want to catch myself shit talking another leader or the CEO ever.
100%. I would just say though, that as careful as one can be, and I completely agree with you, that's the way to be professional. Um, over a 6, 12, 18-month period, people are smart, people are perceptive. They do tend to pick this stuff up. They
Yeah.
they, they pick it up. Um, It's no different from how everyone knows who the performers are on the team and who the performers aren't on the team. They just
Yep.
know. They know, right?
That's true.
No
But
one
it's
likes to
there's
talk about it, but they know. They all know.
That's true, of course. And there's always like, there's still a meaningful difference between being explicit and being implicit about it.
Yep.
But
Indeed.
the last thing we're well over a lot of
Yeah, I
time.
suppose we are.
But like last thing I want to say is that that's one of the reasons why I generally advise founders and CEOs to keep their executive team as small, like trim it down to as small as you can. Like
Yeah.
teamwork is hard, and it's harder exponentially the more you add people to it. And so it is very common for when I join an early stage scale up for them to have like 7, 8 people in their leadership team. And it's like, it's near impossible to bring that team to work as a team
Yeah.
versus like what you really need usually is like the CEO and maybe like 3, 4 tops to like really run the company. But it's hard because every function has this like seat at the table thing of like, oh, function like DevOps doesn't have a C-suite leader. No, we need to come up with the chief DevOps, officer, CDOO. That's a new title. We're going with it. And it's just like the company doesn't value DevOps because there's no CDOO.
Right.
So like, but usually early CEOs haven't understood the value of a well-functioning leadership team and how impossible it is to have when you're adding people beyond the 4 or 5. And then also like how much that whole like because what you said is true, like it's a muscle, the teamwork is a muscle you build and you have to sustain it, and it resets when there's any change. You swap the sales leader and it starts over.
Yep.
You swap the product leader and it starts over. So
I've
it's
seen
hard.
this multiple times as well, that an executive team that's too big is really intractable. Um, my thinking about this, by the way, is sort of aligned to my thinking on the whole CPTO job, which is like in times of change, it is invaluable to have a CPTO.
Yep.
You just move so much faster having one head that it's all bubbling up to.
Yep.
And so what I've seen is in times of change, and it could be good change, or it could be, transformation, difficult restructuring kind of change, but change, it's you're far better off tightening up and having a much smaller, like C-suite, like super executive level. Even though everyone wants to report to the CEO, everyone wants a seat at the table. And I think when things are a little more stable, you can get away with having these larger teams. But so that's sort of the little mini framework I have in mind.
Why don't we stop here and maybe next week? I actually do want to talk about like CRO, CPTs,
Hmm.
whatever, C3PO. Like, let's talk about the conundrum of like,
Yeah.
what does it mean to be executive versus functional leader? And does every functional leader need to be have a seat at the table? You know what I mean?
Right.
Because
Right.
I have a lot of thoughts on what it takes to have chief product capital P officers who run design, engineering, data, product management. Anyway, we want to talk about that next week?
Yeah. That sounds good. Anything else you want to say to take us out?
Not really. I gotta take my kids to the science museum because schools are closed today. So hopefully
Have
not
fun with
thinking about these things.
that. We'll sign off. I'll see you later, Tommy.
All right, bye now.
Bye.